over a period of time, we realized that while investment in solar was occurring and occurring at a huge level, $200 billion in 2021, what was happening in many developing countries was abysmal. Of this 200 billion, only 5% went to all of Africa. Hence, when we talk to investors, when we talk to stakeholders, we realized that the greatest issue that they had was a risk perception. And this risk perception needed to be addressed. Together with our partners, we have therefore come to this occasion to tell you more about the structure of this facility and to look at organizations here to be potential investors in the facility as well. We look forward to the solar finance facility contributing to our objective of mobilizing overall $1 trillion for the solar sector in our member countries by 2030. As we go ahead, we look forward to the strong participation of all stakeholders in making this happen. At the end of the day, the world is not decarbonized unless everybody is decarbonized. And consequently, we need to see how we can help de-risk investments in the countries where it is not happening right now. With this, may I request my colleague Pragya Gupta to tell us a little bit about the facility, and then I will request the panelists to tell us their thoughts about it, and I'll request Santosh, or there's Santosh, who's from Intellicap, to moderate the discussion. Pragya, all yours.
Good evening, everyone. I think first of all, let me thank all my panelists for taking out time from all across the globe for being here today. I really appreciate it and thank you so much. I would be talking about ISA's initiative on the solar facility this evening. Since we have a very heavy panel, I'll keep it short and sweet. So let me jump right in. Firstly, why is the facility needed? The solar facility, we actually comprises of 3 funds: the Solar Payment Guarantee Fund, the Solar Insurance Fund, and the Solar Investment Fund. We actually want to talk about the structure of the facility, how we are operationalizing it, and how the legal structures are going to be in place, and finally moving on to the next steps. As you can see, the current installed capacity in the world for solar was 971 gigawatts in 2020. Out of which the installed capacity in Africa was only 11.5. However, for 2030, a study by IEA suggests that 11.5 gigawatt is actually going to increase to 125 gigawatts. 125 billion of investments is required to meet this potential. But the issue is that according to the stakeholder consultation that we had across the Africas, we found out that the investments are not flowing into the African states. The problem is the perception of investors, wherein they think that they will not get the return on their money back. The investors are looking for a higher rate of return, and they also feel that the regulatory intervention in terms of approvals take a lot of time, and hence the need to create the solar facility. So what is this facility all about? Like I mentioned, the solar facility comprises of 2 major funds: the Solar Payment Guarantee Fund, which is a 100 million fund. It looks at mitigating the off-takers risk for the investors. At the same time, the Solar Insurance Fund is a 50 million USD fund, wherein we are looking to work with MEGA, and we have Mr. Marcus here today, and it'll look to cover the premier cost of the project proponent. We also have the Solar Investment Fund, wherein we're looking to pool in investments from various donors, philanthropies, limited partners, GPs, and investors from across the globe. What is the purpose of creating this facility? We're not creating something new, we're not reinventing the wheel, but it is just an additive to the current scenario through which we want to mobilize investments for solar. We want to create a natural environment and ecosystem through which investors feel safe to invest into the Africas. For the financial bit, we are creating a conducive environment for the investors. And for the technical bit, we are creating a bankable pipeline of projects in Africa. As you can see, ISA is already standing at a very, very strong pipeline of 7.5 gigawatts across 23 member states in the Africas. Which brings me to the next steps. The solar facility was approved by the French minister and our Indian minister at the ISA's 5th Assembly in October 2022 this year. As next steps, we are looking to hire a fund manager and issue an RFP for the selection of a fund manager before December 2022. The hiring of the fund manager would be done by February 2023. We would likely prefer that a GEF or a GCF experience and working in Africa's would be very desirable. For financial and legal structuring, we have an approval of USD 2 million, which was again approved during ISA's assembly in October 2022. As next steps, we are looking to associate with international organizations from the likes of MEGA, IFC, World Bank, and other investors on board. We're also looking to partner with GEF, GCF to raise monies here. A submission of a full-fledged proposal to the GCF is also anticipated by February or other timelines as we discuss and move forward. And for the announcements, we're looking to socialize the facility during COP27, meet with investors, talk to governments, and see what their views are on the facility. We're looking to launch a similar facility for the Asia Pacific and also the LACs in the coming months. And finally, we aim to launch this facility during India's presidency of G20 next year. So without taking much time, I think I will hand it to Santosh and hear what the panelists have to say about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pragya, and very privileged to be in this company of the esteemed panels and part of this conversation. I have 5 of you here and 3 of my panelists joining virtually. So I would not be going into introductions of, I'll just invite the names, and I want to hear more about what you can contribute to the facility. But before that, to give you a certain context to this panel discussion, I think ISA has been doing a number of things: work on policy, building capacity of the national governments, working with the private sector. And I strongly believe that finance is an input to many of the things that we achieve, but is also a good indicator of things done right. Especially commercial finance is an outcome indicator of many things done right. One that achieve commercial finance flows. Nothing is more critical than addressing the risk that the commercial investors perceive in certain activities. And I think this facility is a very, very big step in that, because it completes the whole range of activity that ISA has been doing. Now, on this panel, as we have panelists who have been part of the solar or financing or impact space in many, many roles, I have only 3 questions on this, and I would like everyone to bring their perspective on the 3 questions. First, as we start to kind of roll out the design of the facility, looking at to kind of improve what could be done better and what could be the best way to do it, the first question comes to our mind that there are many such initiatives. I think Pragya talked about that. We have many initiatives. So why, despite many initiatives, certain segments in solar, certain geographies in solar have not been commercially attractive to investors? What could be the possible challenges and what we can do better? So that's the first thing that I want to hear from everyone, and audience is looking for that. Second is that we have all been designing financing interventions for different solar segments, for different geographies. What are some of the guiding principles that we keep in mind to make these facilities more effective? And third, to very specific to these facilities, ISA is going to kind of build this facility for offering the three intervention that Pragya talked about. Any specific suggestion for the insurance facility, for the guarantee facility, and for the deployment of capital facility that we have? So these are the only three questions I have. And I think if we stick to 4 or 5 minutes of per panelist to start with, that would be great. And if there's a time left, we come back with some questions or some kind of follow-up question from what you speak. Now, to start with, since I have my colleagues from MEGA, and MEGA is going to be very critical to give us the insight on how to design an insurance facility better, but not confining to insurance only, but to all the other three questions I said. I'll hand it over to you to have the initial, starting points from you, and then I'll go back to my colleague from GCF. GCF has been doing phenomenal work, and we all know that how many facilities you have enabled across the globe. So your insight on the three questions and how you can take forward, and then I come back to the next set of speakers. So over to you, Marcus.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marcus Williams. I'm with MEGA. I'm the global head for energy and extractive industries, and MEGA is part of the World Bank Group. Is it okay? Okay. So just by way of context setting, so MEGA is one of the institutions within the World Bank Group, and our role is to crowd in productive foreign investment into our member countries, into private projects. For almost most of what we do is supporting projects, capital coming into projects, equity or debt. And within that, we cross all sectors, but energy is a very big part of what we do. And within the energy sector, solar projects are a very big part of our overall portfolio. So I think that, well, I'm not sure if I'm remembering all the questions correctly, but let me sort of try to maybe tackle them all perhaps in one go. But I think the question of risk is a really interesting question. I think that, risk is something that's very subjective, clearly. I think that, we talk to many different investors about projects, and very often we'll be talking to multiple investors who are looking at exactly the same project. And it's interesting always to see how different companies and different investors coming from different places will have quite different views about what they perceive the risk to be in that particular country. But, I think that a lot of the risks that any investor is facing when it comes to putting their money into a project, a lot of them can be managed or mitigated in some way. I mean, you've got flood insurance, fire insurance, insurance against criminal activities, and so on. But the one risk that is very hard for a private company to know how to handle is what is sort of euphemistically called political risk. So the risk that the government is going to do something that is going to be adverse to your project. And that's true, frankly, if you're a domestic investor or a foreign investor. But I think it's especially of a concern if you're a foreign investor. And when we look at the kind of markets that within the World Bank Group, we are trying to encourage, we are, by definition, we are focused on the developing countries, and very often those countries are having to look to get investment from overseas to come into their projects. And I think that's especially true for energy projects being long-term infrastructure projects that are often very expensive. They are predisposed towards looking towards foreign investment. And for those foreign investors, the idea that they can look at the business plan, they can do their market analysis, all of these things that any commercial operator is going to do to try and see if they've got a viable business in front of them. But the one thing that they have really no control over is what the government is going to do. And it may be that they feel comfortable about the government today, but 5 years down the road, there may be a different story. And again, I would say that that is actually true of developing countries. It's true of industrial countries as well. I think that is an equally valid risk for many investors going into industrial countries. But so recognizing then that, look, this is a real issue, and it's really it's an impediment that's stopping investment going into countries. That's why MEGA was set up, was to try to provide a guarantee to those investors. And basically our value proposition is we're sort of, the way I think of it is that we're standing in the middle between an investor who's looking to come into a project and who's ultimately going to become our client, but with the government, who is also our shareholder. And so, you know, we're able to say to really to both parties, you know, to the government, we'll say we're bringing in this investor and we think they're a good company who are going to do a good job implementing this project. And to the investor, we're saying, we think the government is going to honor their contractual agreements that they're making to you. And in the event that they don't, then we will step in and try to resolve things. So I think that, you know, risk, it's a huge issue for investors, and particularly when you have investors who are looking, you know, the world is a competitive market. And so they can pick and choose where they want to place their investment. And so anyway, so I think that's sort of, I think, where we're coming at it from the risk point of view. I think in terms of the general principles, it's sort of clear that for a power project that it's just, yeah. Yeah. Okay, sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah, please wear the headphones. I think that would give you a better audio.
It's quite loud. Okay. Maybe I'll keep going in the meantime. Okay. So just then thank you, about general principles. I mean, you know, it sounds a bit idealistic to say this maybe, but I don't think there's any reason why a power project can't in fact be a win-win-win all the way around. If you think of the different stakeholders in a solar power project, you've obviously got the investors and you've got their lenders. You've got the energy sector in the country and the host country government and the authorities and the regulators and all the different bodies who are looking at a project. You've got the local community where the project is sited. All of these different constituencies, and a good project will be one that represents a win to every single one of those constituencies. And I think that comes from various, and it's entirely doable. And I think there are many good projects, so that is exactly what is happening. I think if you have a strong sponsor, a sponsor who really wants to go in and be a long-term partner in the country and to make a difference as well as to make a return, I think that's really important. And I think if you've got a government that is sitting there and really understands that, you know, for them to win, it's important that the investor is able to execute their investment plan for the long term and really to manage their project through the life cycle that was originally intended. So I think that being transparent about the having a master plan in place, allowing projects to come forward in a way that is sensible and credible and balanced is very important. Yeah, so I think those are sort of just some of the fundamental principles.
These are very valuable insight. I think with my colleagues at ISA, they have been doing a lot of that in the project development, and if we get the guarantee flowing, then we have a next step there. So I'll move on to my next speaker from GCF, and GCF has been phenomenal work doing, Mr. Soji. So you know what are the kind of challenges in the new facilities and what a facility should not do or do. So as we talk about these facilities, solar financing facility and the three offerings, your insight from why solar sectors are not kind of scaling up in solar despite many of the interventions, and what we can do better to make them scale.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for that. I think it's, I'll talk very quickly in terms of GCF, and I'll ask, and I'll answer your question. So in terms of GCF, basically in short, GCF is an organization that takes money from the global north to invest in projects in relation to climate impact in the global south. We are not so much in terms of sectors. We're somewhat sector agnostic. Historically, we've done a lot of kind of renewables because for us, those were kind of relatively easy wins when we first started. And thus, mitigation makes up around 70% of our portfolio. In the last few years, we've focused a lot more on adaptation, especially in terms of kind of resilient infrastructure, livelihoods, agriculture, etc. So that's what we do. Our portfolio currently, as a GCF is about $11.2 billion, of which the private sector, I didn't talk about, I head up acting director for the PSF, private sector facility. Our portfolio within the private sector facilities is around $3.7 billion. And from a co-financing, it's about $11.1, $11.2 billion. So, what do we seek when we look at kind of opportunities within the, not just, in solar, but pretty much in terms of projects. I think the reality is in terms of jurisdictions that we work in, which is in LDCs, most of Sub-Saharan Africa and SIDS, small island developing states, the thread is pretty similar. You're looking for kind of sustainable projects. Yes, we do get kind of grant funding from the global north to pass to the global south. Historically, a lot of that has been through grants, but now we're providing debt, we're providing equity guarantees. So those for us are the kind of the instruments that we use. I've been charged with doing more from an equity perspective, as well as also the guarantees. Why? Because the reality we all know, and I think it's very acute now, but we all know that inflation's going up, interest rates are going up, supply of capital is limited, and capital is becoming more expensive. We know that the public purse is limited. We need to basically partner with the private sector to try to bring those, the funds from the private sector in. We also know from research that roughly about $90 to $95 trillion is under management, by a lot of asset management companies globally, but less than 2-3% of that, has been allocated towards, impact, climate, etc. So there's a lot of capital that is looking for, or that we need to bring in terms of the climate and impact, which now leads to your question. Ultimately, whilst historically we've provided grant funding, we look at projects that are sustainable. If a project is not sustainable, it doesn't matter. It won't be long term. That's the reality. And it will rely continuously on grant funding. And we know, as I said before, in terms of where we are today, funding is becoming a lot more difficult to access. So, we seek partners who are credible. One of the things that we say is that you can have a bad project but good partners. You can structure around it, right? You can have a good project and bad sponsors, and it won't fly. So it's absolutely critical that you have partners who are credible and who have integrity. That's number one. Number two, as Marcus mentioned, I think especially in what we call kind of social and regulated infrastructure, in terms of political risk aspect is absolutely critical. And of course, I think the reality is that, from a kind of consistency of government policy, what we typically have in many of the jurisdictions that we work in is not that you have bad policies. In many cases, there are bad policies, but what makes it slightly more difficult from a funding perspective is inconsistent policy, where there are kind of changes, because you're not able to structure around it. If you have a bad policy, it can be structured, to address some of those risks. It will never be totally mitigated, but there are ways in order to try to make the projects slightly better. So that's the second aspect. The third aspect is, I know that a lot of us, we talk about the gap, whether it's it's the electricity gap, etc. But in many cases, there's a difference between having an understanding of the market and or the want and the need. They're very different, right? Because the reality, in many cases, consumers might want a product or a service, but they're not able to pay for it. However, if they need it, i.e. it's what I call the kind of demand-led, then they in many cases are willing and able to afford that the service or the product. So what we typically look for is appropriate, what we call market sizing. It's not just about market size. The market could be massive, but the vast majority are not able to pay for it, which is a challenge for whatever service, which is a challenge. So for us, it's important that is the market sizing is understood and addressed. And in terms of the fourth aspect is the actual implementation, because in many cases, yes, there are a lot of kind of opportunities. Yes, the market is there, but are you working with the right partners? Do they have local understanding of all the kind of what we call the feasibility studies, technical studies, environmental studies? Have they all been addressed? And if within the context of that project, is it appropriate? So typically, these are some of the things that we typically look for. And whilst, as I said, we've provided a lot of kind of grant funding and concessional debt, because typically the way we work is that we provide debt at a lower rate in order to mobilize blended finance from the private sector, and the private sector have their own kind of market return expectation. So we ensure that the market, the private sector achieve their returns expectations, and thus we take a lower return from our concessional funding that we provide. But having said all that, it's important for us that projects are sustainable, because we know that long term they cannot rely just on grant funding continuously, especially in light of our global macro environment that we find ourselves today. So I think I'll leave it there for now. And
this is working. This is working. Can you hear me? Yeah, this is working now. Thank you very much. So I think from Mr. Marcus and Mr. Sozi, we got some guiding principle of what a facility should do, how we should approach about a project, and how we can choose a partner. So partner and project are the two things that we got some clarity on. I'll come back with a few more questions if time allows to understand about slightly more. But my next three set of panelists have been deploying capital. So they have been identifying the right partners and right kind of projects. And they have been doing it for multiple countries, multiple type of projects. So I want to kind of learn from them that how they have been deploying capital, what are the challenges they see, where they can use the facility. Obviously, the first 3 points I said apply to them also, but if they can give some more perspective of a practitioner, that when they go to finance, when they go to kind of identify a project, what kind of risk instrument they think that, oh, ideally they would have been there, but they're not here. So how we can design that better. So I will go to my virtual participants here. So Sabine, if I can call you to talk about the work World Bank is doing in financing solar and the great work that we're doing with SRMI. This facility is trying to kind of unlock certain sectors which are not commercially viable, certain kind of segments which are not viable. So some comments on why we are not able to scale certain sectors and certain segments, what we can learn about the existing intervention that could be brought down to this facility design or the implementation. And then any kind of thought you have that, okay, if this facility could offer something like this, or in this manner, I would have been able to deploy more capital. So over to you, Sabine.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here. And happy to see that MIGA, our partner institution, is also present with Marcus. So 4 years ago, we created SRMI with ISA and AFD. And we decided to do that because we felt that even if we had a lot of risk mitigation instruments in the world, the real problem was that we didn't have a pipeline of bankable projects that could actually get those instruments that existed already. And so together, we've been, for the last 4 years, developing strong programs in developing countries. Now we're working in over 50 countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, trying to have the right enabling environment, the right policies in place to then have the bankable programs and projects that could actually get the instruments. So we're now at a point where both ISA and the SRMI World Bank is actually launching those facilities on risk mitigation instruments. We're looking at risks on bankability of off-takers, which have definitely been absolutely critical for any future IPP projects that would actually be implemented. But for that specifically, for example, in our case, what we're actually looking for is those projects that are really at the forefront. And so we have a lot of low-hanging fruits that have actually happened, amazing tenders that actually got launched, successfully having projects built. So that's great. But then what's the risks that are not being looked at and the ones that are not successful? And so what we've been really tackling is on the curtailment risk. So in our case, providing, as the World Bank, financing for governments to have the right grid, the right infrastructure to allow for those solar and wind projects to be dispatched without curtailment. So when you sign a PPA that says take or pay, you actually know that normally it's going to be all dispatch and the utility is not going to have to pay for 20, 30, 40% of that generation without actually having any use for that generation. The second type, again, on the bankability of off-taker is even though we're working very much upstream on utility support, trying to work on subsidies, trying to look at, having tariff reforms, reduction in losses, in the end, all of that is actually quite slow and takes years to actually lead to a bankable utility, if ever we end up with a bankable utility. We have so many examples, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, where unfortunately, because of multiple reasons, we're not able to actually bring down the cost of generation and hence not able to actually lead to prices that are actually bankable for the utility. So on that, we're looking at potentially trying to find ways to reduce the cost of those solar and wind projects to a level which is low enough that all utilities could actually be able to pay for it. So we're proposing to work also with ISA and under the solar facility and ours under viability gap financing. So having grant financing that would cover some of the capex to ensure that the PPA price would be at a price tag which is low enough, so let's say 2 or 3 cents for utility that actually can't pay more than that. In this case, we're still able to leverage private investments in a country where today the solution is or you do full grant financing for public generation, or you stay with what you have today. And BAU is simply having diesel, extremely expensive agricole, and absolutely no solution for actually a bankable utility and providing the right service to the country. The last aspect I wanted to mention is that we're not just looking at utility scale. We're also looking at mini grids. And for that, we've been launching a support in DRC and about to do the same in Somalia, where we are providing funding with the GCF. We got our first facility approved in March last year. We have a second facility which is about to get approved next year. And the idea is to use $30 million of grant and use it as its reimbursable grants. And we are structuring it in a way that it's covering the demand risk for those mini grid solar and battery storage projects. We're speaking about very large mini grids covering over 5 million people that would get connected to those mini grids. And for that, the main constraints that we've heard from IPPs and mini grid manager was that the first few years, it's very difficult because you have those mini grids producing a certain amount of power. But then what do? Because the problem is that the sizing of your mini grid is for 20 years. And the first few years, your demand is not where it's going to be in 10, 15 years. So the time that the demand picks up to where it needs to be, we're actually allowing for a gap financing to cover any gap that may arise between what has been expected under the business plan of the mini grids in accordance to the agreement with the IPP. And we are covering that risk. So it becomes a bankable mini grid program, and the first one of that scale in sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe to answer your last question on how we can actually really have the solar facility pick up, I think the key word is flexibility. We need to be flexible in client countries like ours. We don't have a choice but to adapt to what they really need. We need to be a bit innovative as well. We have a lot of instruments. The idea is not to replicate any existing instrument, but trying to find really the gaps that are there. Why are some instruments not being used? Why aren't they happening? And try to be quite simple in the way we are structuring the new instruments. So I'll stop here and happy to take any questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sabine. This was helpful, and I think I would still try to kind of get an answer that for which kind of project you will get this facility to provide you the insurance and guarantee that you can deploy more. But I think that's for the later discussion. Now, coming on to my next speaker, I think I'm going to all the people who are deploying capital. So I will reach out to my AFDB colleague to talk about their experiences of, because Africa is the focus of this facility. If you can package your experiences, difficult to package in this 5 minutes, but if you can tell us that what we can do to unlock the commercial viability of certain segments that we have been kind of chasing but not able to do that, and how this facility can play a role, guiding principles and your insights.
Thank you very much for the question, and indeed, thank you for inviting me to this important panel discussion. Let me first start. I mean, the African Development Bank obviously has been investing in energy projects for many years across the continent, but we've placed energy at the very top of our agenda for Africa a couple of years ago, because energy, as we all know, is a critical input for economic development at large. And in that context, solar, we consider that a real opportunity for Africa. We have launched a number of initiatives that focus on solar specifically, such as our flagship Desert to Power initiative that is trying to seize the solar potential of the Sahel countries, where we've also been able to mobilize sort of a package of concessional and other funding, including from the Green Climate Fund, to help de-risk some of those projects, particularly IPPs, through partial risk guarantees to backstop the payment obligations of the public utilities, for example, but also to provide sort of concessional loans that can be blended with more commercially oriented loans to ensure that some of these projects materialize. Let me just come back 1 second to what the DG mentioned earlier around perceived risk, because I think that's actually quite important, because in Africa, there is a huge perceived risk. There are obviously actual risks, but the perceived risk is significantly higher. And if we look at some statistics, I was looking recently at Moody's Analytics, that actually the default risk on infrastructure projects in Africa is the lowest globally. So there's clearly work that needs to be done sort of to address that perceived risk, while at the same time that we're working obviously on the actual risks that are there, and I don't want to sort of ignore them, but there's clearly a perceived risk premium that is sort of being applied in the African context that we need kind of to address and fight against. In terms of some of the lessons or recommendations that I can mention in terms of the work that we have done investing and creating facilities and funds, I would like to mention 6 points, and some of them have sort of come across already from previous persons who intervened. First is, it's absolutely critical that you have a clear investment thesis that really highlights what specifically is your facility or fund trying to do. How does it sort of compare to what's already in the market? How is it additional? How does it sort of create synergies with some of the efforts that are ongoing? I think this is absolutely essential, and I think you've done a lot of work in that regard on the ISA side through all the consultations that you've been organizing. The second is, and I was pleased to see that also on the slide earlier, it's absolutely critical that you obviously do a competitive selection of the fund manager or facility manager. So just to make sure that it's transparent, that sort of you get the best kind of talent for managing that facility. And also for many investors, certainly from the DFI side, it's absolutely essential that there's sort of been a competitive fund manager selection process in the first instance for us to be able to consider investing in such a facility. The third, as it was mentioned by the colleague from the World Bank, is really around flexible instruments. It's absolutely critical that you have instruments that address real market needs, that sort of define the appropriate tenors, terms, sort of the risk return profile that is required. So it's really important sort of to also be close to investors, to kind of the market segment that you want to support in order to have those instruments, but also to be able to adjust when market conditions change, as we're seeing at the moment. The fourth point really is around speed of delivery. Sort of the ability of the fund manager to deploy resources relatively quickly. I think we certainly want to avoid having a facility that is sitting on a lot of funds but is not able to deploy, and that really directly links to the quality of the fund manager and the investment team. So again, it's very important sort of to make sure you have the right talent that can deploy those resources quickly. A fifth point, which is really critical and often forgotten, is that it's essential that you have project preparation, project development component or facility as part of that fund that can help to prepare projects, that can help to address certain issues in order to make those investments then investable for the fund to come in. And it's also, from our experience, important that the fund manager has also a stake, has skin in the game in that project preparation facility, whatever it's 20%, 25%, whatever kind of the ratio is, but there needs to be skin in the game sort of to align incentives. And I think last, but certainly not least, and for me, that's certainly going to be a key point for, I think, the facilities that ISA is trying to launch, is around the necessity to have the required concessional resources, sort of to put that blended facility together. And that obviously requires sort of being able to tap into resources from climate finance, whether it's the Green Climate Fund. On the African Development Bank side, we have our Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, CEFA, which is our in-house blended finance facility, has grown significantly over the last couple of years with over $300 million in grant resources for CEFA mobilized. And CEFA can take those risky junior tranches in layered fund structures. Just to give you an example, we provided last year 10 million junior equity in the first fund focused on clean cooking, Spark Plus, and that has enabled other more commercially oriented investors to come into such a funding structure. So again, I think these types of facilities that can provide those concessional resources to render other facilities operational are absolutely essential. I think those are some of the recommendations based on experience I would like to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. That was very, very helpful. I think, I know that many of the suggestions are kind of being incorporated into the facility. The one point that you highlighted about the flexibility, I think that's the reason why these kind of facilities should be, working closely with the sectoral institutions who are having the mandate of the sector, and not focus on an instrument or a focus on a particular kind of viability outcomes, because you need to take those flexibility in. And we know that that's a challenge. Now, coming to my next speaker, Mr. Salab. So you have been, as we heard about the private sector's challenges in deploying capital into these segments, because they see these segments as riskier, and IFC has been deploying a lot of capital in the private sector. And you have been doing a number of work in Asian countries and looking at what has been deployed. So building on that what private sector looks for deploying capital, because that's what we do. And second, you have seen the Asian development of solar, what we can learn from there. And using your experience inside, you can guide us something that we can do for this facility. Over to you.
Okay. Thanks. I hope I'm audible. Yeah, thanks. Okay. So thanks for inviting me here. I think a lot has already been said by my colleagues from MEGA and World Bank, Sabine, and I don't want to get into, I won't repeat those. And I think my previous speaker from AFFD has has clearly laid out the 6 guiding principles of the facility. So I'm going to take that conversation forward. So first of all, within your facility, how do you get the maximum bang for the buck? I think that is a critical question you should be looking at. It is not just another facility. There are tons of facilities available. It's a small amount. It's a finite capital. How do you make that capital work to maximize the impact? And you measure that impact maybe in terms of private capital mobilized, maybe a leverage of 8x, 10x, whatever it is. So then to answer your question, why have some of these facilities failed in the past? It's not about the instruments. If you have to answer that question, you have to look at specifically the country context. And within each country, there are critical paths for or impediments for solar financing. It really depends on the landscape of that country and where is it in its evolution. When we started financing in India 10, 12 years ago, even demonstrating a solar project was difficult. Today, people say it's almost like a commoditized. Today, the challenges in India are different. It's more around securing supply chain. The way the panel prices suddenly go up, bidders are complaining that from the time they win the bid and the time they actually start financing, because of the panel prices go through the roof. So the changes. My colleague talked about curtailment risk. Then there is currency mismatch risk in many of these African countries. So deployment of facility, you please look at every country context and do it. Then to get the scale, I think a lot of the smaller countries in Africa, and we have experience using our Scaling Solar in Africa program, in order to get tariffs low, which is what the government and consumers want, you need a large market. And therefore, there has to be a way of aggregating markets of different countries in Africa into a large pool so that the global bidders get interested. And the way you do that is through standardization approach. So your facility principles should be very standardized, consistent, transparent, and ideally, in addition to the project preparation that was talked about, if you can even staple financing to it from the facility and from investors like IFC or other MDB. So you say, okay, here is a project document, we'll take it for bidding. This is how the payment risk is covered, and the following investors will provide financing. Just staple the contracts with them, then it becomes very powerful in that country context. So that's second. I think how do we scale it? That is the biggest challenge. You can have a few projects here and there, but how do we scale it? And you mentioned about blended finance. The next frontier to capture is how do you use solar technology with battery, with hybrid, in order to provide solutions for the manufacturing industry, around the clock power for, say, decarbonization in cement, steel, etc. I think that's where a lot of the applications may come out. Hydrogen, I don't know whether that's in the mandate of ISA or not, but that is another thing that will come out. So as you learn from these solar facility, you can expand the mandate in future to incorporate battery solutions, incorporate hybrid power, and really expand it. And I think lastly, it's about partnerships. For the facility to be really effective, you need to build partnerships with the entire ecosystem. It could be private investors, developers, government, private financiers, so that there is some teeth in the facility which achieves a road to sustainability. Because you will have $100 million, somebody may just use it for payment security, how you won't be able to replenish it. How do you have the maximum use of it? So have some teeth that you keep pushing the road to sustainability in that particular country. The taxonomy in that country, you keep pushing that using concessional funding, using donor financing, using the facility. And we can talk hours on that. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we are just compiling the insight and probably will create a compendium that will give to the fund manager saying that you have to follow this once we design that. But I think the point you made about looking at the country context, and I think the flexibility point was put earlier. I think we have to be looking at how we can take these into context of the country. So the instrument have to be calibrated, the approach has to be calibrated, the sectors have to be identified. It's a job that we have to do. Now, I want to move on to my next set of speakers who have been really the multi-sectoral, instrument, multiple roles that they have, kind of donned. And they can, guide us from the point of view of some of the third party who have been kind of looking at the sector from a very different roles. So not only as a investors or developers, but in a very diverse set of roles. And my next speaker, Ms. Anita George, have been, phenomenally effective in many of the roles he has done. And I think I would request her to talk about first about how we can design the facility better. And the challenges, we have not been able to scale all the segment of solar equally or in all the countries where solar has the potential. So obviously we need to do something better. This facility has a role to play, how we can design it better that it can attract commercial capital. And any guiding principle that we need to keep in mind that would allow us to, I think a lot of been said, but I think it's good to have the confirmations from all the experts and also a guidance on topics that we are missing. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
You are on
great.
mute, so you have to unmute yourself.
No, actually, I'm not on mute. Can you hear me? Let me try.
We can hear you now.
Okay, maybe it was the headphones. So first and foremost, a big congratulations to ISA for launching. Excuse me, is it audible? Should I continue? Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up from Sabine, so I'm going ahead.
I can't hear her. Can you, ma'am, just give me a moment. I'm trying to get the audio right. Some technical snag here. Just give me a moment. I'll give you a go ahead once I start hearing you. Just give me a moment.
All right.
I'm just getting a white noise from here. Ma'am, you speak now. Let me check if I can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
No, not yet.
Oh, I think Santosh, the people on the screen can hear me. I'm seeing a thumbs up from both.
Is it our side of the tech problem? Yeah. So Sabine, you can hear ma'am speaking, right? Okay, perfect. So it's our side. Give us one moment, ma'am. Let me just try what's the problem. Okay.
Okay.
So ma'am, apologies. I have to kind of go to the next speaker till I figure out the problem in this. So I'll go back to my next speaker who is here in physical form. And then I'll try to figure it out what's the problem and then I'll come back to you. Is it okay, ma'am?
Okay. Yes, for sure. The interpreters
I
can
can't hear you, but Sabine, I'm hoping that she approves my okay request. Thank you. So going back to the next speaker, I think again I have two of my speakers virtually, so I'm moving on to the person who is present here. So, Mr. Christoph, you see the discussion about the facilities role and the challenges the solar sector is facing. Your comments on how we can address the challenges. I think there are multiple, perspectives coming around. One is that finding the right project, finding the right kind of partners, finding the right kind of instruments and having flexibility. But over to you for your additional suggestions and how we can incorporate some of your insights.
First of all, thank you very much for your invitation. I'm the Director for Sustainable Development at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I just took my position a few days ago. So forgive my my absence of knowledge on financial issues. As you know, the climate urgency and energy crisis places energy transition at a turning point. We see an acceleration of support for clean energy in the coming years, and government bet on renewable energy first for energy security and independence, and secondly, as a solution for mitigate climate change. The French President Emmanuel Macron, who was here yesterday, has massively developing renewable energies, one of the key objectives of the vision of the energy future of France. A national energy planning exercise will be launched next year. On solar, the objective set by the president is to increase solar energy production tenfold by 2050 to reach 100 gigawatts. But despite our efforts, we are still not on a trajectory aligned with the objective of the Paris Agreement or on Agenda 2030. One of the key challenges is that the investment remains insufficient, particularly in developing countries. The International Energy Agency estimates that current pledges of investment in clean energy has to double by 2030. Since 2016, the French Development Agency, AFD, has committed 1.5 billion euros to concrete projects in developing countries over the world, including 1 billion euros in ISA signatories countries. This does not include all the funding also provided by the Agence Française de Développement for enabling infrastructure necessary for solar uptake, electricity network, their interconnection, and energy storage. Public investment are important, but if we want to go from millions to trillions, it is vital to mobilize private finance through innovate mechanism. We heard several initiatives in which the International Solar Alliance is playing a leading role. First, the Renewable Risk Mitigation Initiative, which combines technical assistance and risk mitigation instrument to leverage private capital. Second, the Solar Facility, the ICA, launches to attract private capital to flow into underserved market in Africa. The Indian presidency of the Solar Alliance and future presidency of G20 has set itself very ambitious targets for solar development. I want to reiterate France's strong commitment and support to the alliance and its objective, and that we will jointly carry leadership in championship the development of solar energy in Africa and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. You said that you don't have much knowledge or experience of finance, but I think sometimes what we need is direction. We can get the expertise and knowledge, but what you said was not anyway kind of giving you that statement that you don't know the finance and the part. But I will now try to see my luck with the technology and see if ma'am is audible here. Can you try speaking one couple of words that I see if it's working?
Good afternoon to all of you.
Not working for sure, but just give me a try. I think the tech team is doing something.
Okay, maybe you can ask Clifford to speak, because I think you were able to hear Sabine.
Hello, can you hear me? Well, I know you can hear me.
Clifford, if you can try to.
Anita, did you put the English channel?
No, I didn't, but I couldn't find it.
I don't know if the panel can hear me, actually.
Can you speak something if you can?
Yeah, actually,
Hello?
I think they can hear me. That's because you didn't put the English channel, maybe.
Just confirm, Clifford, that you.
Where do you find the English channel?
You have it on the lower box, translation, and you put English.
Oh, interpretation. Okay. Hello, can you hear me now, Santosh?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you now. Sorry for this.
Okay. No. It was my bad. Sabine just gave me a tutorial on selecting the English channel.
Thank you, Sabine.
Yeah. Okay. So once again, congratulations to ISA for taking forward this very, very important initiative. Having been involved with the solar sector in emerging markets from IFC's first megawatt of investment in the sector to actually being able, through institutional investors like Caisse des Dépôts, to mobilize around $5 to $6 billion for the sector in India itself, and then much more through the Scaling Solar program across. There, as you can imagine, many lessons to be learned. First and foremost, I want to thank all the earlier speakers, because I think each one of you, I had many points and each one of you covered a lot of them very eloquently. So that saves me repeating it. So like Shalabh said, I would say let's look at what can make this facility successful based on all the lessons that we've learned from being in this sector for so long. The most important thing I would say is that the facilities should catalyze the market and not replace the market. Very often we've seen large subsidized funded public driven institutions and facilities which, instead of crowding in the private sector, actually crowds out the private sector. So I think this very stringent test or filter and asking yourself the question, are you being additional, crowding in the private sector, or are you crowding out, is a very important one. And this goes to also the fact that each market, as many of the people earlier mentioned, has its peculiarities and experiences. In some of these markets, solar has progressed. There's a very active private sector. There's an active debt financing sector. So I would say in those type of markets, really try and catalyze those to come together. In the public, in markets where you do need public sector and you do need blended finance much more, then tailor the instruments accordingly. And another aspect that I've seen is how do you make this scalable and replicable? So very often, as part of the World Bank Group, we did many firsts, like the first megawatt, the first rooftop solar, the first company that was doing solar pumps in emerging markets, as well as among the first large solar parks. One of the speakers earlier mentioned evacuation, and this is, I think it was Sabine. It's very important that then public money actually goes towards building up this infrastructure. And as someone mentioned, that this may lead to the public sector financial institutions being able to do more. Actually, in the specific example, the Rewa Solar Park, the World Bank was able to do less in terms of quantity, but in terms of impact and transformation of the solar sector in India, I think they were able to do much more than having put a lot of money into other public entities. So in solar, we are fortunate because there is a lot of private interest. So the key is how do you catalyze and crowd in the private interests? One suggestion I have for the facility, again, instead of making one large subsidized, blended funding mechanism that is funding projects, but not encouraging other financiers to be able to compete because it's no longer a level playing field, maybe something to think about is really creating facilities, and with the use of technology, this becomes even easier, so that all funds existing in the market in Africa, and there are quite a few that are coming up, have access to these instruments. So you, in a sense, become a fund of fund than just one big fund that's directly financing projects, because then the second question you should ask yourself is what happens when you are no longer there as an ISA facility? Will the market still exist? And that question, I think, is another one that one has to keep asking through these blended facilities, which have a very important role to play. The third aspect, and this was mentioned by many, is really the consistency in policy, best practices, documentation consistency. And we've seen in South Africa, in Peru, in India, that when you had consistent documentation through repetitive bids, the private sector actually gained confidence and came in and were able to bring down the tariff because of the increase in competition. These are, again, factors that need to be kept in mind. So I would say also to really use the people, we have a lot of individuals from the multilateral world, from the bilateral world, who have retired and who have years of experience. Tap into them. And again, I would say using technology as a method to aggregate both expertise and talent, as well as deploy capital more across the board than just to a few projects, would really go a long way towards making these facilities that ISA is creating a big success. Thank you.
Thank you. This was very, very, insightful and concise to what we're asking for. I think we require all the knowledge, all the insight to make it work. I'm going to my last speaker for today's panel, but I think he would bring a very different perspective. So Mr. Clifford is from GreenMax Capital and he has been deploying capital. So Mr. Clifford, over to you to hear your perspective that how this facility could make you deploy more capital and scale solar better. You have the context in what I'm asking this question, why we have not been able to do so, and your insight on how we can do that well.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. And
you have to go through the tips that Sabine has given to ma'am on going to the different channel. Can you hear? Okay.
yeah, I'm in the English channel, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Great, thanks. So thank you so much for inviting me today. And kudos to ISA for this great and very important initiative. I didn't expect to be the last speaker, but it gives me the benefit of having heard what everyone else has said. Those of you who know me know that I have a reputation for pushing the envelope, and so I'm going to try to do that today and focus on some things that I think maybe have been a bit missing from the discussion. GreenMax Capital is an advisory and fund management firm working in the clean energy space and emerging markets for the last 28 years. And as a fund manager, I think we bring some different perspectives. So the first issue that I think is very important for the fund to tackle head on is what market segments are we really talking about here? Because I've heard most of the discussion today focus on the IPP segment. Except for my esteemed colleague from the World Bank speaking a little bit about mini grids, which was music to our ears. But each segment in solar in Africa has a very different context and a very different set of problems that need to be solved to free up capital. I would argue that in the IPP segment, the instruments already exist to facilitate projects. And the fault of those instruments are that they're way too complicated and they require engagement from governments and utilities in Africa who are not really well suited to work within the context of international project finance structures. The second problem I see with the IPP segment is that there's plenty of capital available for investment. The problem is that there's not enough projects to invest in. And the problem with there not being enough projects to invest in is not that there aren't good developers out there that know how to develop projects. It's not even that there's not the will of so many governments to see their energy sector transform to renewable energy. The problem is that there's not sufficient energy demand to warrant the building of new power plants. We need to focus more on distribution, densification, and building up demand for energy, because right now you've got, I can name 6 or 7 funds focused on the IPP sector in Africa at their inception, who have now shifted to investing in distributed generation. And it was a difficult decision for them to take, but there was just no deal flow. And there was no deal flow because the power need, the theoretical power need is there, of course. But right now, so many of these countries actually have a power surplus. So that needs to be factored into the thinking. We would argue that where this fund really needs to focus is in distributed generation. And even in distributed generation, the market subsegments all require different approaches. So we can talk about solar home systems, we can talk about green mini grids, we can talk about commercial and industrial standalone solar, the C&I space, and we can talk about the public sector. And each of those require very different types of risk mitigation instruments. So I think the fund has to think very carefully about which of those segments it wants to tackle. And once it's made that decision, then it can structure its risk mitigation instruments appropriately. The next thing I'd like to focus on is the need for simplicity. The instruments that exist to provide risk mitigation are just way, way, way too complicated. It takes years, not months, it takes years to put together a risk mitigation package in the renewable energy sector in Africa. That's nuts. As a global society, we simply don't have the time for that. And I would challenge the donors who are present here, who have done such an incredible job in raising the awareness about the need for energy transition and the need for an equitable transition and the need for energy access, to look inward at your own procedures and figure out how you can deploy capital through an instrument like the ISA is trying to establish, and do it swiftly and do it in a way that reduces the bureaucratic nonsense that we as fund managers and private sector trying to engage have to deal with. I mean, to deploy just a $50 million fund that we co-manage has taken, 4 years of preparation because of the intricate donor requirements. That can't be in the situation that we're in. Please look inward and figure out how to deploy simply and swiftly. And finally, because this is such a large facility, there's obviously going to be a multiple number of donors and multiple number of investors in this facility. If the donors are not fully aligned from day one on market segments, on purpose, on business model, on structures, on governance, the fund will have a great amount of difficulty in fulfilling its mission. So donor alignment, in our opinion, lack of donor alignment has been one of the key issues in making many of the instruments ineffective. So let me end there. I apologize if I'm being a bit irreverent, but I think the state of the world that we're in requires us to all think out of the box and think about doing things differently.
Thank you, Mr. Clifford. I think as a facility that is looking to kind of change the status quo in certain sectors, we need to think out of the box, and we are kind of appreciative of the concern that you raise about kind of alignment, etc. I think ISA has been working on that. ISA is a kind of big example of how alignment can happen over certain issues of solar. So I think that DNA could be passed on to this facility, that how they can align different stakeholders there. I don't have a lot of time to kind of engage in another round of questions, but what we can promise is that if there are burning questions from the audience, so I can let them ask. And then I will try to kind of summarize in 1 or 2 minutes. I have taken some pointers from every one of you that you have said. And apart from my pointers, there's a whole detailed list of inputs that has been put into that, and that will there, but I'll try to summarize the key takeaway messages. But if audience has any questions on that, we would like to kind of spend 5 minutes to take the questions to the panel or to the ISA team or to on the facility in general. Is anyone having any question? If not, then I would say that ISA team is available. The facility is going to be having multiple such interactions in the future to kind of get things in motion. So, I will try to kind of do a quick summary of what we discussed. Yeah.
My name is Akram Al-Muhammadi from the Regional Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. My question is, sorry, you can hear me now? Yeah. Okay, good. My question to the representatives of the MIGA and what? Wait. Yeah. I just I'm interested to know that your eligibility criteria for working in the country, developing countries, is there a specific criteria? For example, the fragile countries or the conflict affected countries, are you working in these countries, or is there any eligibility criteria? Thank you very much.
This is for the ISA to work in or this facility?
Yes, for the media to provide the insurance or guarantee.
Okay.
For the GCF. And for the GCF also, I want to know if you are dealing with for example, UN agencies or with the government, or which how you work this kind of. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I will just repeat the question. The question is about whether this facility would have any specific criteria or kind of parameters to work into different countries, especially the fragile countries. That's the question. So yeah, if Pragya, you want to answer, or somebody wants to answer, or.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, just very quickly, because I know we don't have much time. From MIGA's perspective, we can work in any of our member countries, and to be a member country of MIGA, a country has to be first a member of the World Bank, and then they sign up to us separately. I'm glad you asked me a question, though, because it gives me a chance to fix what I didn't say before, which was how excited we are to be working with ISA on this facility from MIGA's perspective. And I think a lot of the panelists talked about the need to be aligned and to have partnerships and to have sort of a really considered approach to trying to bring projects forward. Cliff's point about distributed generation is absolutely right. That's clearly where the market is going, certainly in the next few years. And I think that for us, we see ISA as being a really important partner to help us to figure out how to do that in a sensible way. And in terms of FCS, I mean, we have, yes, we work in FCS as a priority, but I think any country we see on the wall here, I think we can work in.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So typically we work through what we call country ownership. So we work with countries, in terms of what their kind of climate strategy is. We work through what we call national designated authorities, NDAs. And in terms of the projects that we do, typically we also request for what we call non-objection letters, NOLs. So that's how we work. And from a partnership perspective, we work with what we call the accredited entities. So you have to be an accredited entity and you have to go through kind of the, we look more at the fiduciary kind of duties, reporting, kind of standards that organizations have. And we work with both international as well as regional entities and local entities. Historically, we've worked very much with internationals, kind of the large MDBs, but now we've been charged with working more with direct, accredited entities, because they have a better understanding of some of the challenges that, locally, and they come up with, solutions that we believe are able to address, the innovations and solutions that it come with. So in short, that's how we work through, kind of country ownership and through accredited entities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think time for me to provide some summary of what we discussed. I'll try to summarize each one of you with key messages, but difficult for me to get hold of all of these things in my 1 or 2 line summary, but I'll try my best. But we are taking it every word and we'll try to kind of follow it in a sense. So we started with, Marcus giving us a very good analogy that risk is subjective, and probably he highlighted the need for the managing the political risk and a kind of country risk and how that can play a role. And I just said that hardest risk is the political risk. So, and that we have also seen from the different kind of analysis. So we'll look at that. We'll also look at your suggestions on, how to convince both the parties, government and investors, to kind of come align and work on that. Your guiding principles, we have noted down. So strong sponsor and how to go about that. We'll try to factor that in. And obviously we'll require your insight to design the facility as it can serve the purpose. Mr. Soji talked about some of the challenges that they have into the different kind of jurisdiction that we have and how that works and what we can do. And also you talked about the need for credibility plus integrity into that projects when we select a project, how we can see that it's meeting all those things. Social and regulatory infrastructure that you talked about, political risk is critical, and consistency of government policy is critical to do that. I think ISH work on the public, shaping the policies and working with the government could be a very, very strong enabler for this facility to come handy. Sabrine gave some examples about beyond the large scale solar to microgrids and the work she is doing at SRMI. And she also talked about the off-taker risk, being managed properly. So the guarantee facility would be one of the things that can come into picture. Bankable utilities, she highlighted that not many utilities have been able to change the economics. You have to make the solar viable, only the investment flows. It is just not additional capital. You have to make the solar viable, and that's where the focus lies. Daniel, spoke about the initiative that you are running, and then perceived risk is huge in Africa, but it is slightly overhyped, as you might say. That's not that much. So can we calibrate that? Can we educate and say that, okay, it's not as big as you are saying, and there are pockets where we can find out alignment. Competitive selection of the fund manager was one point you highlighted, and I think that's critical to get a fund manager who is capable, who is transparent, and who is committed to the cause that ISA is championing. Also, I think I would add that the fund manager selection has to be seen in the context of entirety of this exercise, multiple geography, different kind of segments, different kind of expectations, and the need for flexibility and simplicity that I'm picking up from Clifford, who highlighted in the last. Salab, you talked about getting the bang for the buck for this facility and kind of looking at how we can get low tariffs and other things. And I think that goes very well with the economics of the solar sector, how we can work on that. You also give us input on how we can focus on decarbonization of the industry as a play where ISA can bring solar and battery together to achieve the decarbonization could be a very big play for us. Christoph talked about taking this million to trillion. I think that's the kind of goal, while the facility might be looking at $200 to $300 million to start with. But the kind of applicability, the kind of scope we have, $1 trillion would be something that we should dream. I think that's a good goal to chase. Ms. Anita talked about the experiences she has in catalyzing the market and focus on scalability and replicability. I think her point that how the public money goes to create some kind of unique success stories. We have seen that in Reva Park. So we can think of how we can leverage the capital, public capital, to take it to the next level. She also highlighted the consistency of policy, etc. My last speaker spoke from the practitioner's angle that how to deploy capital and what we are missing. I think as we have highlighted that flexibility is one of the hallmark of this facility, understanding the context, the hallmark. So I think your comment on that, whether we are only focusing on megawatt solar and a grid connected solar, yes, that would be a consideration for many countries, but that does not mean this exclusive focus is there. It factor in the productive use of solar and other facility that could come into handy. So with this summary, I'll hand it over my mic to our Director General of ISA for the closing remark.
Thank you. No closing remarks, except to thank you. Santosh is the person who did all the heavy lifting, the intellectual heavy lifting for this facility. He works for Intellicap, and as Intellicap, they have been our partners right from the beginning. You saw the map that Pragya showed of the various consultations that were done across the world, thanks to him. But before we end, I want a picture with all of you. And my suggestion is, since we have people on the screen as well, why don't you just keep sitting? Santosh, Pragya, and I will stand behind you. And Nikhil, can I ask you to take a picture? Nikhil, can I ask you to take a picture? We'll stand behind them.